stared at her phone screen, scrolling through her Facebook messages with a small smile on her face. For the past year, her chats with Ken had become the highlight of her day. They'd connected through a mutual friend's post, bonding over their shared love of Nollywood movies and jollof rice recipes. At first, Kemi had been cautious about talking to a stranger online. Her mother had always warned her about the dangers lurking on the internet. But Ken seemed different. He was funny, caring, and always knew how to make her laugh after a long day at her receptionist job. As the months passed, their chats grew longer and more frequent. Ken would send her good morning messages that made her heart flutter. They'd stay up late discussing their hopes and dreams. Kemi found herself opening up to Ken in a way she never had with anyone before. One night, as they were messaging back and forth, Ken sent a message that made Kemi's breath catch. "Kemi, I think I'm falling for you. I know we've never met in person, but I feel like I've known you my whole life. What do you think about meeting up sometime?" Kemi's fingers hovered over her phone screen. A part of her was thrilled at the idea of finally seeing Ken face to face. But another part was nervous. What if he wasn't who he said he was? What if meeting in person ruined the connection they'd built online? After a few moments of hesitation, Kemi typed out her reply. "I'd love to meet you, Ken. I have feelings for you too. Let's make it happen." They agreed to meet that weekend at a popular cafe in Lagos. As the day approached, Kemi's excitement and nerves grew. She spent hours picking out the perfect outfit and fixing her hair. When Saturday finally arrived, Kemi arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. Her palms were sweaty as she ordered a soda and found a table near the entrance. Every time the door chimed, she looked up expectantly. At exactly 2 p.m., a tall man with kind eyes and a bright smile walked in. Kemi's heart skipped a beat as she recognized Ken from his profile photos. He was even more handsome in person. Ken's face lit up when he spotted her. "Kemi?" he asked, approaching her table. Kemi nodded, suddenly feeling shy. "It's nice to finally meet you, Ken." He sat down across from her, his smile never fading. "I can't believe you're really here. You're even more beautiful than your pictures." Kemi blushed, ducking her head. "Thank you. You look just like I imagined too." As they began to talk, Kemi's nerves melted away. Conversation flowed easily between them, just like it had online. Ken was charming and attentive, laughing at her jokes and leaning in close to hear her over the cafe's noise. Before Kemi knew it, hours had passed. The sun was starting to set outside the cafe windows. "I can't believe how fast the time went," Ken said, checking his watch. "I hate for this to end. Would you like to go for a walk?" Kemi nodded eagerly. They left the cafe and strolled through a nearby park, talking and laughing as the sky turned pink and orange. When they reached a secluded bench, Ken turned to face her. "Kemi, I know we just met in person, but I feel like I've known you forever. These past few hours have been amazing. I'd really like to kiss you, if that's okay." Kemi's heart raced. She'd been hoping he would ask. "Yes," she whispered. Ken leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind. When their lips met, Kemi felt sparks fly through her whole body. The kiss was soft and sweet, everything she'd dreamed it would be. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. "Wow," Ken breathed. "Yeah," Kemi agreed. They kissed again, more passionately this time. Kemi felt like she was floating on air. As night fell, Ken walked Kemi to the bus stop. "When can I see you again?" he asked, holding both her hands in his. "How about next weekend?" Kemi suggested. Ken beamed. "I can't wait." Kemi floated home that night, replaying every moment of the date in her mind. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful about love. Maybe not all men were like her father, who had abandoned her family when she was young. Maybe Ken was different. Over the next 2 months, Kemi and Ken saw each other regularly. They went on picnics, visited museums, and spent hours talking at Ken's apartment. Kemi found herself falling deeper in love with each passing day. On the third visit to Ken's place, things became heated as they kissed on his couch. When Ken suggested they move to the bedroom, Kemi hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. She trusted Ken completely. Their first time together was tender and passionate. Afterwards, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Kemi felt truly happy and loved. They made love 2 more times over the next few weeks. Each time, Kemi felt their connection growing stronger. She started to imagine a future with Ken, marriage, children, growing old together. But then, everything changed. One day, Kemi messaged Ken to make plans for the weekend. She waited anxiously for his reply, but none came. She called him that evening, but it went straight to voicemail. At first, Kemi tried not to worry. Maybe he was just busy with work. But as days passed with no word from Ken, her anxiety grew. She sent more messages, left more voicemails. Nothing. After a week of silence, Kemi decided to go to Ken's apartment. Her stomach churned with fear as she knocked on his door. There was no answer. A neighbor poked her head out of a nearby apartment. "Are you looking for Ken?" the woman asked. Kemi nodded. "Do you know where he is?" The woman's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry dear, but Ken moved out last week. Didn't say where he was going." Kemi felt like the ground had dropped out from under her. Ken was gone, without a word. How could he do this to her? As she rode the bus home, tears streamed down Kemi's cheeks. She felt used, betrayed, and utterly heartbroken. All the old pain from her father's abandonment came rushing back. Men couldn't be trusted. They would always leave in the end. Little did Kemi know, her journey was only beginning. The truth about Ken, and her own past, would soon turn her world upside down in ways she never could have imagined. 2 months after Ken's disappearance, Kemi sat on her bed, staring blankly at the pregnancy test in her hands. 2 pink lines stared back at her, confirming her worst fears. She was pregnant, with Ken's child. Kemi's mind raced. How could this happen? They'd been careful, and now, here she was, carrying the baby of a man who had vanished without a trace. She thought about her options. Abortion crossed her mind, but the idea made her stomach churn. Despite everything, a part of her already loved this tiny life growing inside her. Adoption was another possibility, but could she really carry a child for 9 months only to give it away? As the days passed, Kemi found herself unable to make a decision. She knew she needed to tell someone, to get advice. But the thought of disappointing her mother was almost unbearable. It was in this state of turmoil that Kemi received the news that would change everything. She was helping her younger sister, Lola, with homework when their mother, Mrs. Adeyemi, came home from work looking troubled. "Girls," Mrs. Adeyemi said, her voice hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you." Kemi and Lola exchanged worried glances as their mother sat down heavily in her favorite armchair. "I received a call today," Mrs. Adeyemi continued. From your father." Kemi felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Their father, the man who had walked out on them over 15 years ago. "What did he want?" Lola asked, her voice small. Mrs. Adeyemi sighed. "He wants to see you both. He says he's sorry for leaving and wants to make amends." Kemi scoffed. "After all this time, why now?" "I don't know," their mother admitted. "But he seemed sincere. He's coming to Lagos next week and asked if he could visit." Kemi's mind whirled. First the pregnancy, and now this. It was too much. "You told him no, right?" Kemi demanded. Mrs. Adeyemi looked away. I told him he could come." "What?" Kemi exploded. "How could you?" "Kemi, please," her mother pleaded. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But maybe this is a chance for healing. For all of us." Kemi stormed out of the room, slamming her bedroom door behind her. She collapsed onto her bed, angry tears streaming down her face. How dare he? How dare her father think he could waltz back into their lives after so many years? And how could her mother even consider letting him? As Kemi lay there, her hand unconsciously moved to her still flat stomach. She thought about the child growing inside her, a child who would be born without a father, just like she had been raised. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become what she had always resented, a single mother, abandoned by the man she loved. The week leading up to her father's visit was tense. Kemi barely spoke to her mother, spending most of her time in her room. She debated telling her family about the pregnancy but couldn't bring herself to do it. Not with everything else going on. On the day of the visit, Kemi seriously considered not showing up. But curiosity and a strange sense of obligation got the better of her. She needed to see the man who had caused her family so much pain. As she rode the old, rickety bus to her mother's house, Kemi's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at her father for abandoning them. Betrayal from Ken's disappearance. Fear about her pregnancy. It was all too much. Old Axis Day, the conductor shouted, snapping Kemi out of her thoughts. Yes, she replied, gathering her things. As she stepped off the bus and into the bustling streets of Lagos, Kemi took a deep breath. She could do this. She would face her father, hear what he had to say, and then move on with her life. She had to be strong, for herself and for her unborn child. The walk to her mother's house seemed both too long and too short. Before she knew it, Kemi was standing in front of the familiar green door. She could hear voices inside, her sister's, her mother's, and two male voices she didn't recognize. Her heart pounding, Kemi knocked on the door. When no one answered, she realized they probably couldn't hear over the noisy generator. Steeling herself, she turned the handle and stepped inside. The scene that greeted her in the living room would be forever etched in her memory. Lola was sitting on the couch, talking animatedly to two men. One was older, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that crinkled when he smiled. The other was younger, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. Kemi's eyes were drawn to the younger man. There was something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. "Good day, sir," she said to the older man, assuming he must be her father. Then she turned to the younger man. "Good day, see." The words died in her throat as recognition dawned. It couldn't be. It was impossible. "Ken," she gasped. "Ken." The room fell silent. Ken's eyes widened in shock, his face paling as he recognized her. Before anyone could speak, Mrs. Adeyemi walked out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "Oh, welcome, Kemi," she said, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. "I can see you've already met your father and your older brother, Ken." Kemi felt the world tilt on its axis. Brother. Ken was her brother. The implications hit her like a tidal wave. She had been dating her half-brother. She had slept with him. She was pregnant with his child. Bile rose in her throat. Kemi swayed on her feet, her vision blurring. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was her mother's panicked voice calling her name. When Kemi came to, she was lying on the couch. Concerned faces peered down at her, her mother, Lola, her father, and Ken. The memories came rushing back, and Kemi felt sick all over again. "What's going on?" she croaked, struggling to sit up. Her father, the older man she had greeted earlier, stepped forward. "Kemi, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. We never meant for this to happen." Kemi looked at Ken, who was standing in the corner, his face a mask of shock and horror. "You knew," she accused. "You must have known." Ken shook his head frantically. "I swear, Kemi, I had no idea. I didn't even know I had sisters until a few months ago when our father contacted me." "A few months ago, around the time he had disappeared. So that's why you vanished?" Kemi asked, her voice trembling. "Because you found out we were related." Ken nodded miserably. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I never imagined. I mean, what are the odds?" Kemi laughed bitterly. "The odds? The odds of what? Of sleeping with your own sister?" Mrs. Adeyemi gasped. "Kemi, what are you saying?" Kemi stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. "I'm saying that for the past few months, I've been dating Ken. We met online. We were intimate." The room erupted in chaos. Mrs. Adeyemi began to weep. Lola looked horrified. Their father buried his face in his hands. "There's more," Kemi said, her voice cutting through the noise. She took a deep breath, knowing that once she said the words, there would be no going back. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Ken stumbled back as if he'd been struck. "Pregnant," he whispered. Are you sure?" Kemi nodded, tears streaming down her face. I found out a few weeks ago. I didn't know how to tell anyone." Mrs. Adeyemi rushed to Kemi's side, enveloping her in a tight hug. "Oh, my poor baby," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "No," their father said, his voice heavy with guilt. "It's mine. If I hadn't left, if I had been there for all of you, none of this would have happened." Kemi pulled away from her mother, anger burning through her grief. "You're right," she spat at her father. "This is your fault. You abandoned us. You started a new family. And now look what's happened." She turned to Ken, who looked like he might be sick. "And you, how could you just disappear like that? Do you have any idea what I've been going through?" Ken opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Kemi looked around at her family, at the pain and shock on their faces, and felt suffocated. She couldn't bear to be in that room for another second. Without another word, she turned and ran out of the house, ignoring the calls of her family behind her. As she ran through the streets of Lagos, tears blurring her vision, Kemi had no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she needed to get away. Away from the truth. Away from the impossible situation she found herself in. But as the sun began to set and her legs grew tired, Kemi realized a painful truth. No matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape the reality of her situation. She was pregnant with her half-brother's child. And she had no idea what she was going to do.